Hey, is this thing on? Are we recording? Can I get a tech person? Oh, for the love of EdTech. Joining us today is Dr. Megan Conrad, Senior Researcher at Explore Learning, as well as my co-host Matt Gerberick from SOIDA. So hello to both of you.
Good morning. Good morning, Kara.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Yeah. So, Megan, we like to start off this podcast always by asking people about their journey into education. So, I'm just going to ask you how you ended up in your role as senior researcher and kind of what led you to the educational field.
Yeah, I took a little bit of a roundabout way to get here. I think initially I wanted to be an elementary school teacher. I wanted to be a kindergarten teacher. That's where I saw myself thriving and having a lot of fun. I always worked with kids, babysat, camp counselor, all of that. But then I discovered psychology in high school, taking it as an elective, and I became really, really interested and fascinated with it. So I said, I'm going to major in psychology, thinking I would do clinical work with kids. And then I realized that psychology is much more than just clinical work. I discovered research and the process of it and just fell in love. I realized that this is what I wanted to do, take these difficult questions about human behavior, about learning, and be able to explore them and answer them. That was just a really cool process to me. So I went to graduate school at Rutgers. I got my PhD in cognitive and developmental psychology. I did a lot of research looking at children's learning in everyday settings. So I was really interested in what learning happens outside of school. I looked at how parents and kids talk to each other and what's being focused on and what kids are learning from that. I looked at watching television, reading books, did some really cool studies at zoos and science centers, and all of those kinds of informal experiences. I worked as an assistant professor at William Patterson in New Jersey for a couple of years. I got tenure and then the same year left. I think I encountered what I know a lot of teachers are encountering, that frustration point. We were having mass layoffs. There was a lot of things that were no longer making it feel like the right fit for me. So I knew I wanted to stay in working with children and doing something that to me felt as fulfilling as teaching did. And so that's how I started to look into ed tech. So I've been at Explore Learning as their senior researcher for about a year and a half now, and it feels amazing. It feels like home. It gives me that, ability to ask all of those research questions that I want to ask, but I still know that I'm impacting the thousands and thousands of children who are using our platform every day in their classrooms. So it's been really fun to get to do this very applied research, working with real students and real teachers in real classroom settings, and knowing that I have this potential to make a really large impact with my research.
So to kind of kick us off then into our work with teachers and ed tech and in the K-12 setting, a lot of times it's tool first and then figure out what to do with it kind of thing. So can you highlight the significance of relying on high quality, rigorous research when selecting ed tech for the classroom rather than something that a tech director or someone finds at a workshop and brings back and tries to figure out how to make it fit?
Yeah, so in my role, I do a lot of work with both administrators, curriculum coordinators, and teachers. And, when I'm talking about research in ed tech selection, a lot of times I make sure that people understand the importance of both being research based and being evidence based. So the first thing is that an ed tech product that's designed really well should be research based, meaning that they are designed using insights from this high quality, timely, and relevant empirical research, right? It should be grounded in the learning sciences. So a lot of products will have white paper. I'll talk a little bit about ESSA, but they might have an ESSA tier 4 logic model. They have these kinds of things that show that the product was really grounded in empirical research. So we've designed it to, you know, based on these learning sciences, it should work for our students, right? Because it is built on this high quality, rigorous research. So I always say that educators and administrators should evaluate these studies so that they can make informed decisions about, is this going to work for my educational goals, for my curriculum, and for my particular student needs, right? So looking at who are these studies done with. That's a big thing that I talk about a lot, but that they should support those learning outcomes that are relevant to you and your curriculum and your student needs. They should be aligned to research-based standards. They should be aligned to current research-based pedagogical approaches, right? So do they have inquiry-based learning, project-based learning, all of those kinds of great things? That's the first thing that we look for, right? Is it research-based? But then the next thing that I think is important is making sure that they're also evidence based. So, evidence based means that they are routinely engaging in empirical research to assess the efficacy of that tool in real world classroom settings, right? So, yes, I've designed it based on this pedagogical approach, I've designed it based on this research, but does that mean that it actually works when I implement it with my students? Does it actually work when we have all of these problems about implementation and all of the real life things that get in the way? So, a company should be doing that ongoing evaluation. This is what my role is with Explore Learning. I am the one who is doing this ongoing, constant evaluation, seeing are the tools delivering on their promises, right? So, this is where teachers also can take a really active role in making sure, is this doing what I need it to do in my classroom with my students? Is it achieving those learning outcomes? Is it facilitating student engagement? Is it contributing positively not just to academic success, but also things like curiosity, critical thinking, problem solving skills, right? I'm really interested in things like mindset. Is it fostering a growth mindset, right? Is it helping my students discover a love of learning? All of those things should be routinely assessed, and both, by this high quality, rigorous research, by internal researchers like myself who work for the company, also external researchers, academics, all of that. So that's what I think is really important to look at, both that base of the research and that ongoing evidence.
Yeah, I think that's really, I love all of that. And, it's an important part about the evidence because as you go out and you try and work with teachers or get teachers to, in some cases, still buy in, there's that, well, how is this going to make this better? Because I'm going to have to take on learning something. And then how is this going to actually be used? So, there's a lot of PD that's done about here's how to use something, like where the buttons are, and here's how you make this do this. But making sure that we also address the use of it, and what you alluded to there with the evidence base, and how am I going to use this with my students. So I think those are excellent points.
Yeah, and along that line, I know that we at Explore Learning have a lot of different options for professional development. And when I'm working with district administrators, I talk about the process of research not as like evaluative. Like, I'm not trying to see if your teachers are doing the right thing. Like, this isn't a test, it's not a gotcha thing. What I say is I'm evaluating it to see where are we seeing success and where are we not seeing success, and then how do we particularly tailor things like professional development. What kind of messaging do we need to give to teachers? What do we need to find out about teachers, about how they're using or how they're experiencing outcomes, so that we can support those most at risk, those who aren't, maybe implementing it well, or getting the benefits that they expected. So we're really thinking about research as an ongoing process to help support and facilitate teachers in their use of the EdTech.
Okay, so I'm curious, and it's awful. I don't the abbreviation that you mentioned for evaluation, what was that abbreviation?
ESSA.
ESSA. Okay.
Yes.
So, can you talk a little bit about what exactly that is? And then maybe it will help lead into strategies that you could offer educators or overall districts to find and evaluate the efficiency of research associated with various products, ed tech products specifically.
Yeah. So I personally rely pretty heavily on the ESSA tiers of evidence. So These are put forth by the Institution of Education Sciences, and they talk about four different tiers of determining the type of research, the type of evidence that was done to show the outcome of that product. So you could have, there's four tiers. So the lowest tier, tier four, would be this white paper or this logic model, right? So it shows that the product was built on research, and these are the ways that we expect the product to lead to learning outcomes, right? So that's kind of the lowest step. And then as you go progressively higher, it gets more and more rigorous in the terms of the type of study, right? So you might have a correlational study, which would be an ESSA tier three. So we're just looking at the product in use. Are students who are using it more doing better? Right. And so that would be a great thing to see. But it also could be, well, maybe just the most prepared students are having the easiest time using it, and that's why they're achieving better. So then the next step, tier two, would be something like a quasi experimental. So we might do something a bit more rigorous in terms of making sure that students are equivalent at baseline. I do a lot of this research because it's very hard to do pure experimental research in a school setting, right? So a lot of what I do is say, okay, are they statistically equivalent at the beginning of the year? And then we compare these students who used it a lot versus those who used it less and what the outcomes were. So we can have more confidence in the tool. A tier one study would be a what we call an RCT, a randomized control trial. This is like what you would do if you were testing a new medication, right? Something that we really need to be sure that, okay, you're getting the treatment, you're randomly assigned to get the control. What is the difference that we see? So that would be like the ultimate in terms of the rigor of the study, but it's very, very difficult to practically do that in a school setting. You often need to have some kind of very large grant to support it. So the ESSA tiers of evidence are helpful for people. If you see like a company is releasing an ESSA tier 2 study, we know that that's a little bit more rigorous than an ESSA tier 3 study. This also can align with WWC, which is another acronym that people might be familiar with in the terms of research, the What Works Clearinghouse. This is a space where studies that are in certain academic databases will get reviewed, and they'll determine the level of the study. So it maps on a little bit to the ESSA tiers, but not perfectly. These are good resources, right? So you can look in the WWC and you can see, is my product listed there? The problem with WWC is that it's only for publications that have gotten into the ERIC database or other kinds of databases. So if a company is doing, like if I'm doing something internal, it might not be even eligible to be reviewed. So some studies are in there, not all studies are. So if you don't see a product in something like WWC or the evidence for ESSA website, doesn't mean that they haven't done the work. Doesn't mean that it's not a solid program. It just, for one reason or another, hasn't been eligible for review. We can also look at websites like Learn Platform. That's another way to look for. They're a body that often reviews research, so they can stamp a study as a tier two, as a tier one. There is no official governing body to stamp something as a tier one, two, three, four. So anybody can determine it based on the guidelines. So that's where it can get a little bit tricky. Digital Promise product certifications are another place to look. So some of Explore Learning products have a couple of their product certifications that'll tell you that this is a research-based product. They've gone through the review and they've determined that this is research-based. So those are just some of the places. You can, of course, go to a company's website, see what else they have that may not have made it into those kinds of databases.
Yeah, I honestly didn't realize that those type of places that offered research evidence existed as a teacher.
Yeah, and
That may be maybe
this
that's bad to admit. I don't know.
no, I think that it is a real struggle. I do a lot of that in my work as well, of educating people on research and what does research mean? How do we interpret it? Where do we look for it? How do we understand it? When I was a professor, I published a lot of papers. I'm sure that maybe 20 people read it in my very little circle of academia who are doing those research studies that are the same as me. It can be really hard to find research and then to know what research to trust. So I also think, in additional professional development on products, I love when teachers get professional development about understanding data literacy. I know that we think about data literacy as something we teach our students, but there's a lot of aspects of research and data literacy that I think people could do. It would be really beneficial for them to learn more
Yeah.
about, get more information about.
Yeah, for sure, because I mean, we do a lot of data collection and you read the data, but it's like I wouldn't say you dive deep into the data necessarily unless you're really trying, exactly what you're looking for or need to accomplish for something, or there's, new curriculum coming, or, there are instances where you dive deeper, but for the most part on the daily, it's, you're just looking for a certain piece of data, and once you're getting it you can see and then you adjust accordingly and you move forward. There's not really like that deep dive all the time, so that's really interesting.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, I know teachers already have a million and one things on their plate. It's not something that I would expect teachers to be doing on the regular, but it's why in my communications with administrators and curriculum coordinators, I also say, I'd love to create this research report that I've written you, this 10-page research report. I want to put it in a 1 or 2 page brief, and then you can share that with your teachers. I want to distill the points from this data that are most impactful for teachers to understand. So, for instance, I did a study recently where we have this thing in one of our products called a green light. So, in Reflex, there's this green light, and you want your students to achieve a green light in their usage. So, it's not about, oh, use it for 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes. It's your student should get to this green light. And this is something that we've programmed within to say that a student has reached a certain level of fidelity in their usage of the program for the day. So, we'll tell teachers in professional development, go for the green light, have your students get the green light. But does that message always get across? I'm not so sure. So what I did recently with one district is I looked at students and their green light usage, and I compared students who are identical at baseline and then compared the students who got the green light almost every day in their usage versus students who didn't. So they were still using it often, but they weren't going to that measure that we want them to go to. And I showed huge statistical differences between the students who used with fidelity and those who didn't. That is a data point that I want to get to teachers. I want them to see, this is why we're telling you. We're not just telling you to tell you. We're not
Yeah.
telling you because we want to sell more product. We're telling you because we've designed the program to work in a very certain way, and we want to make sure you're using it with fidelity. So then making sure that I am telling teachers that in a way that is accessible, and they get that information regularly, I think is really, really important.
If you like this podcast, check out our latest, Minds Over Media, a collaboration between SOIDA and the University of Cincinnati, delving into diverse aspects of media literacy. Uncover the power of media literacy through insightful conversations and gain valuable insight from esteemed scholars and dedicated educators navigating this complex landscape. Check it out on Spotify and Apple Podcasts.
So I think maybe you touched on that with your answer, but so you mentioned about teachers and the amount of time that they have, and in some districts, especially smaller districts, they don't have a curriculum coach, or their administrators maybe having other things that they are required to do, and so the time isn't there to do the in-depth pieces that would be nice to be able to do. So, in your opinion, what specific criteria or indicators should educators look for when assessing the reliability or validity of these efficacy studies? So, like the ESSA research and things like that. What are some things it's like, if you've got 15 minutes, is it possible or a half an hour? I mean, maybe the timing could be longer than that, but that would be like the first place to go for determining validity and reliability.
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I think there's a couple things, like you said, like looking for the esoterics of the study. What was the methodology of the study done? Was it a correlational study? Was it a quasi-experimental or experimental? And if you can't even find those words, they're probably trying to hide it from you, right? So looking for those kinds of things about how the study was done is important. I also think it's really, really important for external validity, right? Meaning how well it applies to different groups of students in the real world. What is the population? If you can't even find the population of the study, I think that's another one. You want to make sure that the population of the study looks like the population of your students, right? So what are the demographics of the student used? Is it a high resource or a low resource area? Is there a lot of demographic variability? Is it a private or public school? Looking at those kinds of indicators to see, like, this looks like my students or this doesn't look like my students. It's not end all be all, but I think it is important for thinking about, is this a study that's going to tell me about how this product is going to work with my students? So looking at the sample size, that's another thing that's really important, right? That's already built into the ESSA tiers, that it has to be a minimum sample size of like 300. So looking, was this done with 50 students? Was it done with 500 students? Was it done with 10,000 students? Looking at those kinds of indicators of the study, I think, are important.
And I guess on that same note, the importance of that ongoing piece. So, like, how does that kind of work in your experience with the ongoing monitoring? Like, is it ongoing monitoring of the same students, or is it just continuous ongoing monitoring of students using a certain product? Or what does that look like, and what is the importance of that ongoing piece?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think first of all, the tools should have something built in that's providing real time data. So, you're monitoring individual student progress. So, for instance, our Gizmo STEM Cases product has a heat map that in real time is filling out as students are going through it, right? So, something like this that's constantly giving you new data on how they're doing allows for more timely intervention, more timely support. But the thing about ongoing evaluation is that student needs are constantly changing. The environment is constantly changing. We went through COVID, that radically changed how we think about educating and what our students really need, right? So, it's not, I don't think we could ever say, okay, we did the research study, it worked with our students, let's just keep using this. It's important that we are constantly looking at research as this cycle of continuous improvement. And so this isn't just student data, but it could be things like, are we surveying our teachers and asking them, is this still working for you? What's working about it? What's not? I lead focus groups a lot. I'll come into different districts and I'll sit down with a group of teachers who are using the product pretty heavily. And I'll ask them, how are you using it? Why are you using it in this way? What are your problem points? Or even reaching out to those teachers who aren't using the tool as much, even though they have a district-wide license, and finding out, well, why aren't you using it? What is the problem? So, knowing that things are constantly going to change in terms of what our students need, whether the standards change or our ideas about the best pedagogical practices change. So making sure that we're continually questioning and looking at this data in different ways. Like I said, it might be data that's from within the system, like this real time data monitoring or these data updates that you might get about student progress, looking at external student performance that might be related to the use of the tools, right? So just thinking about, why are you using this tool? Is it because you want to see improvements on some standardized test? Is it because you want to see improvements in, I don't know, students choosing STEM careers? Like, what is your point that you want to be evaluating? And whether that needs to be changed at other times. We might need to reassess and decide, what, I want to see improvements on this metric instead of this. So that's what I mean by this ongoing, continual monitoring. And again, this isn't fully led by teachers. This totally has to be a large shift. I also think it's really important for administrators to create an environment where this is seen as the norm, and again is seen as not evaluative, right? As not a test of a teacher, as not a test of how well you're doing, but as a continuous cycle of we want to do the best for our students. So let's make sure that things are working for you. This is working in your classroom and it's providing the help that we want it to.
Yeah. And so, and I think you mentioned about the shift since pre-COVID, and how ed tech was viewed as sometimes kind of of something that's nice, and but we found how vital it can be. So maybe this is a chance to kind of talk more specifically about the different products and so forth that you have. So my son's in 6th grade, and he's in an advanced or an accelerated math class. How could these tools be utilized in a situation like that versus worksheet packets, quizzes, traditional sit and get quiz kinds of things like that? So how could this be utilized in that kind of an environment?
Yeah, and that's a great point, right? We've seen a large shift from pre-COVID to immediately in pandemic times, and then to now in terms of how we're viewing ed tech. And like you said before, it was just kind of like a nice thing or a fancy thing. Like when I was a professor, like everybody would ooh and ah because I was the youngest person in the department and I was using these cool tech tools, right? Like
Hmm.
it was just seen as ooh, look at this, right? And then it was, man, we really need this because
Yeah.
we're in this setting that is not typical. And then now we're seeing a little bit of a reevaluation period of, okay, what is vital? Are my students spending too much time on their computers? And this is where I think this evaluation piece really comes into play, why it's so important as we're thinking about that. So our products in particular, we have 4 products that are K through 12 science and math. So we have Reflex, which is our math fact fluency. So that's for, those younger grades. We have Frax, which is fractions program. So we usually start students around 3rd to 4th grade on Frax. That's our newest program. We have Science for Us, which is K through 2 science and literacy put together. And then we have Gizmos, which is elementary through high school. And so our heaviest users are probably late middle school and high school of that program. And in all of these, the benefit of the program is that it hits students where they are. So especially with Reflex and Frax, it is tailored to how students are performing in the program. It gives there's a lot of talk about the benefit of one-on-one tutoring. And I think we all have heard that research. We know that that's awesome. But most districts do not have the resources to implement one-on-one tutoring all the time. Teachers do not have the ability to, create a different worksheet for every single student in their class and constantly assess where they are and where they need to go. So the real value of those programs is that it does that for you. It sets those students where they need to be, and it allows you to take the step back and look at, okay, where are students needing more support? Where are the students who are excelling and how do I support them? Where are the students who are struggling? How do I support them? And so it takes a lot of that burden off of you. Gizmos are a great product in that it is, again, really, really flexible. It allows teachers to tailor the materials and fit it to their learning standards and their curriculum. And again, with our heat map in our STEM cases, which are really cool, they're, let students take the role of being like a scientist and answering certain kinds of questions. And it gives you that real time data that, again, is so hard for one teacher to do when they have a full classroom of students. So I do think it's important to ask the questions of, is this benefiting my students and not just a cool thing to be using, or, something that I'm doing just for accountability and to check that box off. But I think that all of our products as supplemental products really do what ed tech should do, which is supporting teachers, taking some of that effort off of their plate, allowing them to differentiate for students, and then also giving them that feedback, that data, that piece that they need to see to track students.
It's like personalized learning for each of your
Absolutely.
students. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I love that they like it in itself evaluates where the student is as opposed to just kind of like, I mean, with a worksheet, I mean, everybody's getting the same, like, because like you said, you don't have time to create 30 different worksheets based on where they are. And so that's where EdTech can come in, where they can assess where the student is and take them from there with the correct activities.
And then being able
So
to grade all those things also.
Oh yeah, that's definitely no. Like I said, I understand the concern about are we relying too much on this? Are our kids spending too much time on this? But you know, like you said, this gives you the benefits, takes that time off of your plate, and because I'm doing this research every day, we know that it works. We are seeing amazing, significant gains in these students even when they're equivalent at base. I literally just finished an analysis yesterday where I looked at students who were completely identical at baseline and then looked at the difference in students in terms of their fluency growth. So students were starting at like 10% fluency at the beginning of the year. Students who used it just a little bit got to like an average of 30 or 40. Students who used our program with fidelity were ending at like 85, even though they all started at the exact same point, right? So it is helping the teacher. It is taking that off their plate, giving them what we know is research based to tell us that students will have the best outcomes, and then evidence based in terms of we see the outcomes.
thanks for listening to our For the Love of EdTech podcast. We hope you enjoyed our conversation today and learned something you can use with your own students. You can find the show notes, resources, and more at www.fortheloveofedtech.org.
For the Love of EdTech is produced by SOITA, the Southwestern Ohio Instructional Technology Association, in partnership with Think TV and CET, the local PBS stations in Dayton and Cincinnati.